close your eyes now and let yourself drift back through the centuries. We're traveling to a time when the world was vast and mysterious, when the ocean horizons seemed endless, and when one man would lead the greatest maritime expeditions in human history. His name was Zheng He, and this is the story of his extraordinary journeys across the seas. Let the gentle rhythm of these words carry you, like waves lapping at the hull of a great ship. There is no urgency here, only the slow unfold of history, the peaceful telling of adventures long past. Breathe deeply, relax, and let us begin. In the year 1371, in the province of Yunnan in southwestern China, a boy was born. His birth name was He. The land of his childhood was beautiful, with rolling hills and clear streams, far from the sea that would one day know him so well. Yunnan in those days was a place of diverse peoples and cultures. The young He grew up in a family of the Hui ethnic group, Muslims who had lived in China for generations. His father and grandfather had both made the pilgrimage to Mecca, crossing deserts and mountains to reach the holy city. They returned with tales of distant lands, of different peoples, of markets filled with spices and silks, and wonders beyond imagination. The boy listened to these stories in the evening lamplight. He heard about the great mosques of the Middle East, about caravans crossing endless sands, about cities where people spoke in unfamiliar tongues. These tales planted seeds in his young mind, seeds that would one day grow into journeys of his own. But the world was changing around him. The Ming dynasty had recently come to power, sweeping away the old Mongol rulers. China was transforming, and young He's life would transform with it. When he was still a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, soldiers came to his province. Yunnan was being brought more fully under Ming control. In the chaos of those times, the young He was captured. As was the practice then for certain captives, he was made a eunuch and sent to serve in the household of a prince. This may sound like a tragedy, and in many ways it was. The boy lost his home, his family, and his childhood in one swift stroke. But history sometimes moves in unexpected ways. This unfortunate beginning would eventually lead to extraordinary opportunities. The prince he served was named Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, and He, despite his circumstances, proved to be remarkable. He was intelligent, capable, and brave. He grew tall and strong, with a commanding presence. He learned to read and write. He studied military strategy and administration. He became not just a servant, but a trusted companion. The Prince of Yan was ambitious. He was the fourth son of the Hongwu Emperor, and he wanted more than a provincial domain. In 1399, he began a campaign to seize the throne from his nephew, the young Jianwen Emperor. This was a civil war, brother against nephew, ambition against inheritance. He fought in this campaign. He distinguished himself in battle, showing courage and tactical skill. When the Prince of Yan's forces besieged the city of Zhengzhou, He was there. When they crossed the Yangtze River to advance on the capital, He helped lead the way. By 1402, the Prince of Yan had won. He became the Yongle Emperor, the third emperor of the Ming dynasty, and he did not forget those who had helped him. He was rewarded richly. He was given honors and positions, and the emperor gave him a new name, a mark of special favor. From that point forward, he would be known as Zheng He. The name came from a crucial battle at Mount Zheng, where the forces of the Prince of Yan had achieved a decisive victory. It was a name of honor, of achievement, of imperial recognition. Zheng He was now in his early 30s. He had risen from captured boy to imperial confidant. He had fought in wars and seen the insides of palaces. He had survived when others had fallen. He had the emperor's trust, and the emperor had plans for him, grand plans, plans that would take him far from the battlefields of China, out onto the vast blue expanses of the sea. The Yongle Emperor was a man of vision and ambition. He had seized power through military might, and now he wanted to demonstrate the glory of his reign. He wanted to show the world that China under his rule was powerful, prosperous, and magnificent. He decided to send a fleet to the Western Ocean, as the Chinese called the waters beyond their shores, the Indian Ocean, the coasts of Southeast Asia, the lands of India and Arabia and Africa. These were known to Chinese merchants and traders. But no Chinese government had ever organized an expedition on the scale the emperor now envisioned. This would not be a military conquest. It would be a demonstration of might through magnificence. The fleet would carry gifts to foreign rulers, establish diplomatic relations, encourage trade, and show the world that China was the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, the source of wonders. To lead this unprecedented mission, the emperor chose Zheng He. It was an extraordinary choice in some ways. Zheng He was a eunuch, a Muslim, a man who had begun life as a captive from a distant province. He was not from the traditional scholarly elite who usually held high positions. But the emperor knew his man. Zheng He was loyal, capable, and brave. He had proven himself in war. He could lead. He could command respect. He could represent the glory of China. And so, in the early years of the 1400s, preparations began. The scale of these preparations was staggering. Imagine a harbor, perhaps at Nanjing, or at the great shipyards along the Yangtze River. Now imagine not one ship, not 10 ships, but dozens upon dozens of vessels being built at once. The largest of these ships were called treasure ships, or baokuan. Historical records describe them as enormous, far larger than any European ship of that era. They had multiple masts, multiple decks. They could carry hundreds of people. They were painted and decorated, flying colorful flags and banners. Alongside the treasure ships were many other vessels. Horse ships to carry cavalry mounts and tribute animals. Supply ships filled with provisions. Water tankers, warships for protection. Transport ships for personnel and cargo. The complete fleet for the first voyage may have included over 200 vessels. And the crews, sailors and navigators who knew the seas, soldiers to provide security, officials and diplomats to conduct negotiations, translators who spoke different languages, doctors and healers, astronomers to chart the stars, writers to record the journey, artisans and craftsmen of every kind. In total, the first expedition may have included 27,000 people or more. It was not just a fleet. It was a floating city, a complete society taking to the waves. The ships were loaded with cargo, silks, the finest China produced, in every color imaginable, porcelain of exquisite quality, bowls and vases and plates decorated with delicate paintings, tea and lacquerware, metalwork in bronze and iron, embroidered fabrics, all the luxuries for which China was famous. These were gifts, tributes to be given to foreign rulers. They demonstrated China's wealth and craftsmanship. They said, without words, "See how prosperous we are. See what wonders we can create. See the glory of the Ming dynasty." Zheng He oversaw all of this. The building of the ships, the gathering of supplies, the recruiting of crews, the loading of cargo. It was an administrative challenge as much as a maritime one. But he was equal to it. And finally, everything was ready. Picture the scene. A harbor filled with ships, their sails furled, their hulls riding deep in the water with all their cargo. thousands of men preparing to depart, families saying goodbye, officials conducting final inspections, priests and monks offering blessings for a safe journey, and Zheng He standing on the deck of his flagship, looking out at the fleet he commanded, tall and imposing in his official robes, carrying the emperor's seal, bearing the weight of the emperor's trust. The year was 1405, the month was summer, and the great fleet set sail, heading south and west, bound for distant shores. Let yourself imagine the moment the fleet left port, the great ships moving slowly at first, oars helping to maneuver them into open water, then sails unfurling, catching the wind, billowing out in great curves of canvas, the ships picking up speed, beginning their journey, the coast of China slipping away behind them, the open sea ahead. For many of the men aboard, this was their first ocean voyage. They had lived their whole lives on land, and now there was nothing around them but water and sky. The ships creaked and swayed. The wind filled the sails. The sea stretched to the horizon in every direction. But the sailors knew their craft. Chinese shipbuilding was advanced. These vessels had watertight compartments, so if one section flooded, the ship would not sink. They had stern-mounted rudders for precise steering. Multiple masts allowed them to adjust their sails to different wind conditions. These were sophisticated ships built on centuries of maritime knowledge, and the navigators had their tools. They used compasses, devices with magnetized needles that pointed north, helping them maintain their course. They had charts showing coastlines and islands. They used the stars, the sun, the patterns of winds and currents. Navigation was part science, part accumulated wisdom, part careful observation. The fleet sailed south, following the coast of China, and then continuing to the shores of what is now Vietnam. They stopped at Champa, a kingdom that occupied part of the Vietnamese coast. Here they could rest, resupply, and let the crews recover from the first leg of the journey. The people of Champa had traded with China for generations. They knew of the Middle Kingdom's power, but they had never seen anything like this fleet. The size of it, the number of ships, the thousands of men. It was overwhelming, impressive, impossible to ignore. Zheng He met with the local rulers. He presented gifts from the emperor. He explained that China wished for friendship and trade, not conquest. The message was clear. Acknowledge China's superiority, send tribute, and you will be rewarded. Resist, and you will face this enormous fleet's power. From Champa, the fleet continued west. They sailed through the waters between the islands of Southeast Asia. Sumatra rose from the sea, a large island thick with jungle. They stopped at several ports along its coast. These were cosmopolitan places. Merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Africa all came to trade in these ports. Goods from across the known world changed hands here. Spices and incense, textiles and metals, exotic animals and rare woods. The markets were noisy with different languages, fragrant with different cuisines, colorful with different styles of dress. Zheng He, himself a Muslim, could communicate with the Arab traders. His multilingual crew could speak with merchants from many lands. They gathered information about routes, about other kingdoms, about conditions farther west, and they dealt with problems. Pirates operated in these waters preying on merchant ships. Some local rulers were hostile or unreliable. The fleet had to be ready to defend itself. There was one particular challenge on this first voyage. A Chinese pirate named Chen Zui had established himself in Palembang, a port on Sumatra. He had a fleet of his own, and he had been attacking shipping for years. He was powerful and dangerous. Zheng He's fleet arrived at Palembang, Chen Zhui reportedly tried to ambush them, attacking with his pirate ships. But Zheng He was prepared. His fleet included warships and soldiers. They were organized and disciplined. The pirates were defeated. Chen Zhui was captured. This was not told as a tale of glory in battle, but as a necessary action. The seas needed to be safe for honest merchants. Pirates disrupted trade and caused suffering. By dealing with Chen Zhui, Zheng He made the waters safer for everyone. The captured pirate was taken back to China eventually, where he faced imperial justice. The ports of Sumatra became safer, more stable, better for trade. From Sumatra, the fleet continued west across the Bay of Bengal. This was a long ocean crossing. For days, there was nothing but water around them. The ships maintained formation, staying within sight of each other when possible. At night, lanterns were lit so vessels wouldn't lose track of one another in the darkness. Imagine those nights at sea, the gentle rocking of the ship, the creak of timbers, the sound of water against the hull. Above, an incredible display of stars, brighter and more numerous than you could see from land, unobscured by any lights. The sailors would navigate by these stars, recognizing constellations, tracking their movement across the sky. Eventually, the coast of India appeared. They had crossed the Bay of Bengal successfully. Now they sailed along India's southwestern coast, heading for Calicut, one of the great trading cities of the age. Calicut was ruled by a Hindu monarch called the Zamorin. It was a wealthy place, enriched by trade. Ships from Arabia and Africa, from Southeast Asia and China, all came to Calicut. The market sold pepper and other spices, the precious commodities that traders sought. Cotton and dyes, gemstones and ivory, peacocks and horses. Zheng He's fleet arriving at Calicut was a sensation. Never had such a large fleet come from China. The treasure ships, enormous and impressive, anchored in the harbour. The Zamorin came to meet these visitors from the distant east. Zheng He presented the emperor's gifts, silks and porcelain, fine crafts that demonstrated Chinese skill. He explained the emperor's desire for friendship and trade. The Zamorin, impressed and pleased, responded with gifts of his own, precious stones, fine fabrics, exotic products of India. Diplomatic relations were established. Calicut would send envoys to China, bearing tribute. Trade would be encouraged. Both sides would benefit. From Calicut, the fleet visited other ports along India's coast. At each stop, the same pattern. Impressive arrival, diplomatic meetings, exchange of gifts, establishment of relations. The message spread. China was powerful, wealthy, and interested in peaceful trade. After months away from home, the fleet began its return journey. They retraced their route, sailing back across the Bay of Bengal, stopping at ports in Sumatra, sailing up through the Southeast Asian waters, and finally returning to the coast of China. They arrived back in 1407, 2 years after they had departed. The voyage had been a complete success. Ships and men had returned safely. Relations had been established with numerous kingdoms. The emperor was pleased. Zheng He reported on everything he had seen. The foreign lands, the trade goods, the rulers and their courts. Writers who had accompanied the expedition documented it all. The knowledge gained would help plan future voyages. And there would be future voyages. This first expedition had proven the concept. China could project its power across the seas. It could conduct diplomacy on a vast scale. It could demonstrate its magnificence to the world. The Yongle Emperor ordered preparations for a second voyage. Rest now, and let the story continue to unfold gently, like a scroll being slowly unrolled. The second voyage began in 1407, shortly after the first fleet's return. Many of the same ships sailed again, repaired and restocked. Many of the same men volunteered to go, drawn by the adventure, by the pay, or by the prestige of serving in the treasure fleet. This time, the fleet had a more ambitious itinerary. They would go beyond Calicut, farther west, to the kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula. The fleet sailed the now familiar route, south along the Chinese coast, stopping at Champa, west to Sumatra, where the ports were now friendlier since the defeat of Chenzui, across the Bay of Bengal to India, visiting Calicut and other ports. Then they continued west, crossing the Arabian Sea. The shores of Arabia came into view. The fleet visited several ports in what is now Yemen and Oman. These were ancient trading centers, places where caravans arrived from the interior carrying frankincense and myrrh. Those precious resins burned as incense. Goods from Africa crossed through here, as did products from Persia and beyond. For Zheng He, this must have been particularly meaningful. He was Muslim, and these were Muslim lands. The language, the call to prayer, the architecture of the mosques, all would have been familiar in their essence, even if different in details from what he had known in Yunnan. He met with local rulers and merchants. He visited markets and mosques. He conducted the emperor's business, establishing diplomatic ties, exchanging gifts, encouraging trade. But perhaps he also felt a personal connection to these places, a sense of homecoming to the broader Islamic world. The fleet also visited the island of Socotra, located where the Arabian Sea meets the Gulf of Aden. This was a remote place, known for its unique plants and animals. A variety of aloe grew there, valued for medicinal purposes. The people spoke a language found nowhere else. At each stop, the routine was similar. The massive fleet would arrive, an unmistakable display of power and wealth. Local rulers would come to meet these visitors. Zheng He, representing the emperor, would present gifts and explain China's desire for peaceful relations. Gifts would be exchanged, agreements made, envoys invited to visit China. The psychological impact of the fleet cannot be understated. Imagine being a local ruler of a modest port city, and suddenly the horizon fills with ships. Dozens and dozens of vessels, some of them larger than any ship you've ever seen. Thousands of armed men, holds full of valuable goods. It communicated power without needing to fire a shot. This was the genius of the treasure fleet concept. It was diplomacy backed by overwhelming but restrained force. The message was, "We are powerful enough to crush you if we wished, but we come in peace. Join us in trade and friendship." After visiting the Arabian ports, the fleet returned home, arriving in 1409. Again, the voyage was successful. New kingdoms had been brought into China's diplomatic orbit. New trade relationships had been established. Rare goods and exotic gifts had been brought back to the imperial court. The Yongle emperor was pleased. He ordered a third voyage. This third expedition departed in 1409 and returned in 1411. The route was now well established: Southeast Asia, India, Arabia. But each voyage brought refinements: better knowledge of winds and currents, stronger relationships with ports along the way, more detailed information about foreign lands. On this voyage, the fleet encountered a new challenge. A kingdom in what is now Sri Lanka was ruled by a hostile king named Alakeshvara. He saw the wealthy Chinese fleet as an opportunity for plunder rather than an opportunity for trade. Alakeshvara's forces attempted to ambush Zheng He and his men when they came ashore for water and supplies. It was a dangerous situation. The Chinese were temporarily cut off from their ships, surrounded by hostile forces. But Zheng, who remained calm, he organized his men, using their military training. They fought their way to the capital city, captured the king and his court, and then returned to their ships with the captives. Rather than executing the hostile king or destroying the kingdom, Zheng He brought Alakeshvara back to China, where the emperor could deal with him. This showed both mercy and the long reach of Chinese power. The king was eventually released and sent home, and a new, friendlier ruler was installed. This incident demonstrated another aspect of the treasure fleet's mission. While primarily diplomatic and commercial, it could and would use force when necessary to protect itself and to punish those who acted treacherously. But the use of force was measured, purposeful, not wanton destruction. By the end of the third voyage, the pattern was clear. The treasure fleet would keep sailing. China's presence in the Indian Ocean was now established. Zheng He had become one of the most important figures in the empire, an admiral known across the maritime world. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, matching the gentle rhythm of waves against a hull, the peaceful pace of a great ship crossing calm seas. The fourth voyage departed in 1413 and marked another expansion of the fleet's reach. This time, they would sail beyond Arabia, crossing to the eastern coast of Africa. Africa, a continent of legends and mysteries to the Chinese. They had heard tales of strange animals, of rich kingdoms, of coasts where precious goods could be found. But few Chinese had ever been there. Now, Zheng He's fleet would establish direct contact. The fleet followed its established route through Southeast Asia and India. By now, many of the port cities knew to expect the treasure fleet. Rulers prepared gifts to exchange. Merchants gathered goods they hoped to trade. The fleet's reputation preceded it. From India, they crossed to Arabia, visiting the ports they had established relations with on the second voyage. Then they continued west, sailing down the Arabian coast toward the Horn of Africa. They entered the Gulf of Aden, that narrow passage between Yemen and Somalia. The coasts on either side were rugged and dry. The water was a deep, clear blue. Here, traders from Africa met traders from Arabia and India. Dhows, those graceful wooden sailing vessels with their distinctive triangular sails, plied these waters carrying goods between continents. The fleet visited Mogadishu, one of the great Swahili city-states on Africa's eastern coast. These cities had thrived for centuries on trade. They were Muslim, connected by commerce and religion to the broader Islamic world. Their architecture showed Arabian influences, with coral stone buildings and intricately carved wooden doors. Their markets bustled with activity. The people of Mogadishu had never seen anything quite like Zheng He's fleet. These enormous Chinese ships, this vast crew, these foreign visitors who came with such ceremony and such gifts. It must have been astonishing. Zheng He established diplomatic relations with Mogadishu's rulers. Gifts were exchanged, agreements made. The Chinese were interested in African goods, ivory from elephants, rare woods like ebony, frankincense and myrrh, and exotic animals. The fleet continued south along Africa's coast. They visited Malindi, another major Swahili city. They may have reached as far south as Zanzibar or even beyond. Each stop followed the same diplomatic pattern. Each expanded China's knowledge of this distant continent. At these African ports, the fleet acquired some of the most exotic goods they would bring back to China. Zebras and ostriches, animals entirely unknown in the Middle Kingdom. Rhinoceros horn and elephant ivory. African textiles and crafts. Leopard skins and lion skins. Most famously, they acquired giraffes. These tall, gentle creatures were transported back to China, where they caused a sensation. Chinese scholars compared them to the Qilin, a mythical creature from legend that appeared during the reign of virtuous rulers. The giraffe's arrival was taken as a sign of heaven's approval of the Yongle Emperor's reign. Imagine these animals aboard the treasure ships. Special enclosures had to be built, food and water had to be provided, handlers had to care for them during the long voyage. It was a logistical challenge, but it demonstrated the fleet's capabilities and the Empire's reach. The fourth voyage also brought back envoys from multiple African kingdoms. These foreign dignitaries made the long journey to China, where they would be received at the imperial court, presenting their own gifts and paying homage to the emperor. The fleet returned to China in 1415. The voyage had been another triumph. China had now established direct contact with Africa. New trade routes were opened. The exotic gifts and animals brought back amazed the court and the public. Zheng He was at the height of his fame and influence. He had now led 4 successful expeditions, each larger in scope than most people could imagine. He had sailed farther than any previous Chinese admiral. He had brought distant lands into tribute relationships with China. He had made the emperor's power and prestige felt across the seas. But challenges were emerging at home. The treasure fleet was expensive. Building and maintaining the ships, recruiting and paying the crews, acquiring all the gifts to be given out, it all required enormous resources. Some officials at court began to question whether it was worth the cost. The emperor, however, remained committed. The voyages enhanced his prestige and China's standing in the world. They brought in tribute and rare goods. They demonstrated that his reign was glorious and successful. He ordered preparations for a 5th voyage. Close your eyes and drift with the story now, letting it carry you like a current carries a boat, gentle and inexorable. The 5th voyage began in 1417. By now, the treasure fleet was a well-oiled machine. The ships were maintained between voyages. Experienced sailors and soldiers signed up for each new expedition. Officials who had been on previous voyages knew what to expect and how to conduct diplomacy efficiently. This voyage would go to the farthest points yet reached. The fleet would sail once more to Africa, but this time penetrating deeper into the Persian Gulf and visiting more African ports than before. The fleet sailed west through familiar waters. Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, all ports they had visited before. But this time, they entered the Persian Gulf, that narrow body of water bordered by Persia on one side and Arabia on the other. They visited Hormuz, located at the strait where the Persian Gulf opens into the Arabian Sea. Hormuz was one of the great trading centers of the Islamic world. Merchants came here from Persia, Arabia, India, and beyond. The city's wealth was legendary. Its markets offered carpets and textiles, precious stones and pearls, horses from Arabia, goods from across the known world. The fleet also visited ports in what is now Yemen and Oman more extensively than before. These desert kingdoms had their own beauty. Mud brick cities rising from arid landscapes, mountain valleys where frankincense trees grew, coasts where dhows bobbed at anchor. Then the fleet continued to Africa. They revisited Mogadishu and Malindi. They sailed further south along the Swahili coast, possibly reaching the region of modern-day Mozambique. The exact southern limit of their explorations is uncertain, but they went far down the African coast, farther than any Chinese fleet had sailed before. At each port, relationships established on the previous voyage were reinforced. New diplomatic ties were created. Trade goods were exchanged. more exotic animals and goods were acquired for transport back to China. The fleet also served as transportation for envoys from various kingdoms who wanted to visit China. By now, word had spread across the Indian Ocean world about the great Middle Kingdom and its magnificent emperor. Rulers saw advantage in establishing ties with this powerful distant nation. They sent representatives with gifts, hoping to be recognized, hoping to receive gifts in return, hoping to open trade opportunities. The voyage was long, lasting until 1419. When the fleet returned to China, it brought not only goods, but also 19 separate diplomatic missions from foreign kingdoms. These envoys were received at court with great ceremony, presenting their gifts to the emperor, paying tribute, and receiving gifts in return. This was the purpose of the treasure fleet made manifest. China was now the center of a vast diplomatic network stretching from Southeast Asia to Africa. Tribute flowed in from dozens of kingdoms. Chinese prestige was at its height, but the Yongle emperor was aging. He had been on the throne since 1402, and the years were taking their toll. He was preoccupied with other matters as well, particularly military campaigns in the north against Mongol forces. The treasure fleet, while glorious, was not his only concern. Still, in 1421, he ordered a sixth voyage. This expedition departed in 1421 and lasted until 1422. It was shorter than some of the previous voyages, and the routes were now so well established that it proceeded almost routinely. The fleet visited the familiar ports: Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, Africa. Diplomatic relations were maintained. Trade continued. More tribute missions were brought back to China. But changes were coming. In 1424, the Yongle emperor died. His son succeeded him as the Hongxi emperor. The new emperor was less interested in the expensive maritime expeditions. He was more concerned with domestic affairs, with consolidating power, with addressing problems within China itself. The treasure fleet was suspended. The ships were laid up in harbor. The crews were dismissed or reassigned. Zheng He, now in his 50s, was given other duties. He was appointed to a military position defending Nanjing. His days of ocean voyages seemed to be over. For several years, the great ships sat in port, unused. The ambitious age of the treasure fleet appeared to have ended. Let your mind rest now in this quiet period, when the ships sat at anchor and the seas they had crossed so many times lapped peacefully at distant shores. The Hongxi emperor's reign was brief. He died in 1425, after less than a year on the throne. His son became the Guande emperor. The Guande emperor had different views from his father. He admired his grandfather, the Yongle emperor, and wanted to emulate his glorious reign. He saw value in the treasure fleet, in China's maritime prestige, in the diplomatic network that had been built. After several years of consideration and preparation, in 1430, he ordered one final voyage. Zheng He, now nearly 60 years old, was called out of semi-retirement to lead it. This would be the seventh and last voyage of the treasure fleet. It would be a grand farewell, a final demonstration of China's maritime power before the age of the treasure fleet came to an end. Preparations began once more. Ships were refitted, crews assembled, cargo loaded. But perhaps there was a bittersweet quality to it all now. This was explicitly conceived as a final voyage. Those involved must have known they were participating in something that would not be repeated. The fleet departed in 1431. Zheng He, grey-haired but still commanding, stood once more on the deck of his flagship. Many of the sailors and officers who sailed with him were veterans of previous voyages. They knew these waters, knew what to expect, knew their jobs. The fleet sailed the established routes. Southeast Asia, with stops at ports they had visited 6 times before. India, where they were now well known and expected. Arabia, where relationships were strong. And Africa, that distant shore that still held wonders. This voyage would reach the farthest points the fleet had ever achieved. Some historical records suggest they may have sailed as far south as the Mozambique Channel, the water between Madagascar and the African mainland. They certainly visited extensively along the East African coast. At each port, it was like a reunion of old friends. Local rulers, who had dealt with the treasure fleet before, welcomed them back. Diplomatic gifts were exchanged with practiced ease. Trade goods changed hands. Relationships built over 30 years were reinforced one last time. The fleet stayed at sea for longer than usual. They didn't return until 1433. It was as if they wanted to make this final voyage last, to visit every port one more time, to ensure that the relationships built over decades would not be forgotten. On the return journey, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, or perhaps as they neared the coast of China, Zheng He died. The exact date and location of his death are uncertain. Some accounts say he died at sea and was buried in the waves. Others say he made it back to China but died shortly after. The details are lost to history, but this much is certain. The great admiral who had led China's fleets across tens of thousands of miles of ocean, who had visited dozens of kingdoms, who had demonstrated Chinese power and prestige across the maritime world, who had commanded the largest fleet of ships the world had seen. This man passed from the world after a life of extraordinary achievement. He was approximately 62 years old. He had served 2 emperors faithfully. He had survived battles and storms and political intrigue. He had seen sights few Chinese of his era ever saw. The markets of India, the shores of Arabia, the coasts of Africa. He had met with kings and merchants, had negotiated treaties, had established relationships that would last for years. The fleet returned to China without him. The ships were unloaded, the crews dispersed. Envoys from foreign kingdoms were received at court. The diplomatic and commercial business of the voyage was concluded. And then the era ended. The Zheng Emperor did not order another voyage. The treasure ships were gradually retired, broken up, or left to rot in harbour. The massive infrastructure that had supported the treasure fleet was dismantled. China turned inward, focusing on domestic concerns, on agriculture and canals and the Great Wall, on land rather than sea. The age of the treasure fleet was over. Rest now in the peaceful contemplation of what was accomplished, of the legacy that remained. Zheng He's voyages were extraordinary by any measure. Between 1405 and 1433, the treasure fleet made 7 major expeditions. They sailed from China to Southeast Asia, to India, to Arabia, to Africa. They covered tens of thousands of nautical miles. They involved hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. They established diplomatic relations with dozens of kingdoms. They brought back exotic goods and animals and knowledge of distant lands. At the time they occurred, these voyages made China the preeminent maritime power in the Indian Ocean. Chinese maps of the era showed a world centered on China, with detailed knowledge of coasts and ports from Southeast Asia to Africa. Chinese diplomatic influence reached farther than ever before. Chinese goods, especially porcelain and silk, were prized across the maritime world. Yet, within a few decades, it was as if the treasure fleet had never existed. China's focus turned entirely inward. Maritime commerce was restricted. building large ocean-going ships was prohibited. The official records of the treasure fleet voyages were largely destroyed by court officials who opposed such expeditions. Even the detailed maps and logs that had been maintained were lost. For centuries, Zheng He was largely forgotten, even in China. His voyages became dim legends, stories of the distant past that people half remembered but couldn't quite believe. The treasure ships, if they had been as large as records suggested, seemed impossible. Surely the stories were exaggerations. But gradually, evidence emerged. Archaeological discoveries of anchors and rudders too large for ordinary ships. Historical records from other countries that mentioned the Chinese fleets. Port cities where local legends told of the great ships from the east. Stone inscriptions that Zheng He's expeditions had left at various locations, recording their visits. Scholars began to piece together what had happened. The voyages were real. The treasure ships had existed. Zheng He had accomplished what the record said. Today, Zheng He is recognized as one of the great explorers and admirals in human history. His achievements stand alongside the most famous maritime figures of any age. His voyages preceded those of Columbus by nearly 60 years, preceded Magellan's circumnavigation by almost a century. Yet his approach was fundamentally different from the European explorers who would follow. Where later explorers sailed for conquest and colonization, Zheng He sailed for diplomacy and demonstration. His fleet did not seize lands or establish colonies. They did not impose Chinese rule on foreign shores. They came as representatives of a powerful empire, bearing gifts, seeking relationships, opening trade routes, and establishing a network of diplomatic ties. This was a different model of maritime power. It showed that a nation could project its influence across vast distances through peaceful means, backed by overwhelming force but rarely needing to use it. The treasure fleet was a demonstration of soft power on a scale never before attempted. The impact of these voyages rippled across the Indian Ocean world for decades. Trade flourished along the routes the fleet had traveled. Port cities grew wealthy, serving merchants moving between China and distant lands. Cultural exchange increased, with ideas and goods and knowledge flowing more freely than before. Chinese porcelain became highly prized across Africa and the Middle East. Pieces from this era have been found in archaeological sites from Zanzibar to Cairo, from Hormuz to Mogadishu. These beautiful objects, painted with delicate blue designs, traveled thousands of miles to end up in the hands of African chiefs and Arabian merchants. Similarly, goods from these distant lands found their way to China. African ivory was carved by Chinese craftsmen. Arabian incense burned in Chinese temples. Indian textiles were worn by Chinese nobles. The treasure fleet had created not just diplomatic ties, but cultural connections. Yet within decades of Zheng He's death, China turned decisively away from maritime expansion. The reasons were complex and are still debated by historians. The voyages were expensive, requiring enormous resources at a time when China faced other pressing needs. Mongol forces threatened the northern frontier. The Grand Canal needed maintenance. Internal development demanded investment. There were also political and philosophical factors. The faction at court that had opposed the voyages gained influence. They argued that resources should be spent on domestic concerns, on agriculture and infrastructure, not on expensive expeditions to distant lands. Traditional Confucian thinking emphasized internal harmony and agricultural development over external trade and maritime adventure. The treasure ships were retired, broken up, or left to rot. The infrastructure that had supported them was dismantled. Maritime trade was restricted, Eventually, building large ocean-going ships became illegal. China, which had briefly been the greatest maritime power in the world, deliberately chose to limit its engagement with the seas. The historical records of the voyages were largely destroyed. Officials who had opposed the expeditions saw to it that detailed accounts were burned or lost. They wanted to erase the memory of what they saw as wasteful foreign adventures. Within a few generations, even in China, the treasure fleet became a dim legend, half remembered and not quite believed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, European nations were beginning their age of exploration. Portuguese ships were probing down the coast of Africa. Spanish ships would soon cross the Atlantic. The age of discovery, as Europeans called it, was beginning. And unlike China, these European nations would not turn away from the seas. The contrast is striking and poignant. China had the ships, the navigational knowledge, the resources, and the organizational capability to dominate the world's oceans. But it chose not to. Europe, which initially lagged behind in maritime technology, chose to invest heavily in ocean exploration and eventually came to dominate global trade and colonization. Historians have long pondered this divergence. What if China had continued its maritime expansion? What if the treasure fleet had kept sailing, voyage after voyage, decade after decade? How might world history have been different? These are unanswerable questions, of course. History happened as it did. But they remind us that the choices nations make have profound consequences, that technological capability alone does not determine outcomes, that cultural and political decisions shape the course of civilizations. Let us drift now into a quieter contemplation, imagining what life was like aboard these great ships during their long voyages. Close your eyes and picture yourself on the deck of a treasure ship, feeling the gentle rock of the vessel, hearing the creak of timbers and the snap of canvas sails in the wind. The treasure ships were floating communities, small cities upon the water. On a single large treasure ship, there might be several hundred people. Across the entire fleet, tens of thousands lived and worked together for months at a time. The sailors who worked these ships were skilled professionals. Many came from coastal provinces, where families had fished and sailed for generations. They knew the moods of the sea, could read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of seabirds. They understood winds and currents, knew how to handle sails and ropes, could navigate by sun and stars. Their work was constant and demanding. Sails had to be adjusted as wind conditions changed. Ropes required maintenance, constantly checked for wear and fraying. The deck needed to be scrubbed and kept clean. Bilge water that collected in the lower decks had to be pumped out. During storms, all hands would be needed to secure cargo, manage the sails, and keep the ship steady. But there were also periods of calm, when the ship sailed smoothly under favorable winds, when the work was routine and manageable. During these times, the sailors would talk and joke, sharing stories and songs. Some would repair their clothes or equipment. Others might carve small objects from wood or bone, creating simple art during their idle hours. The ships carried a whole range of specialists beyond ordinary sailors. There were carpenters who could repair damage to the hull or masts, sailmakers who could patch torn canvas or fashion new sails, cooks who prepared meals for hundreds in the ship's galley, doctors who treated illnesses and injuries, astronomers who calculated positions by observing celestial bodies. There were also soldiers, professional fighting men, whose job was to protect the fleet. They practiced with their weapons, maintained their equipment, stood watch for pirates or hostile vessels. Most of the time, their duties were peaceful. but they had to be ready for action at any moment. The ships carried officials and diplomats as well, men of learning who would conduct negotiations with foreign rulers. They spent their time on the voyage preparing for these meetings, studying reports from previous expeditions, planning what gifts to present and what agreements to seek. Some kept detailed journals, recording everything they saw and experienced. And there were translators, men who spoke Chinese and Arabic, or Chinese and Tamil, or Chinese and other languages of the Indian Ocean world. These were invaluable individuals, making communication possible between the Chinese fleet and the diverse peoples they encountered. Some had learned languages from merchants, others from years living in foreign ports. Still others had mixed heritage and had grown up speaking multiple languages. The daily routine aboard ship had its own rhythm. The day began at dawn with a bell or drum signaling the morning. Sailors would check the rigging and sails, adjusting them for the day's wind. Breakfast would be simple: rice or millet, perhaps dried fish or vegetables, tea. The morning watch would take over, experienced sailors who would guide the ship through the morning hours. Others would turn to their various tasks: repairs, maintenance, cargo checks, cleaning. Officers would inspect different parts of the ship, ensuring everything was in order. Midday brought the main meal, more substantial than breakfast. Rice remained the staple, but there might be fresh fish if they'd been caught that day, or pork or chicken from animals kept aboard. Vegetables preserved by drying or pickling. Soy sauce and other seasonings to add flavor. Afternoons continued with work and watches. As the sun began to set, preparations would be made for night. Lanterns would be lit, carefully positioned to be visible to other ships in the fleet, but shielded so they wouldn't blind the helmsman. The evening meal would be served, usually similar to lunch. Night watches were divided into periods, with different crews taking turns, steering by stars and compass, maintaining course through the darkness, watching for hazards. The night sea had its own character, mysterious, vast, filled with phosphorescent organisms that glowed in the ship's wake, creating trails of blue-green light through the black water. Sleep quarters were cramped. Sailors might sleep in hammocks or on mats, packed closely together. Officers had small cabins, but even these were modest spaces. The constant motion of the ship, the sounds of wood and water, these became so familiar that silence and stillness would have seemed strange. Special occasions broke the routine. When the fleet reached a port after weeks at sea, there was the excitement of arrival, of seeing land again, of the prospect of fresh food and water, perhaps shore leave to stretch legs on solid ground. When diplomatic meetings went well and gifts were exchanged, there might be small celebrations aboard ship. Religious observances also marked time. Buddhist and Taoist sailors might make offerings at small shrines aboard ship, burning incense, saying prayers for safe voyage. Muslim crew members, including Zheng He himself, would perform their daily prayers, facing toward Mecca, as best they could determine from their position at sea. These are moments of spiritual practice, provided comfort and continuity, connecting the sailors to something beyond the endless horizons of water. The treasure ships carried with them the necessities of life for long voyages. Water was stored in large jars and barrels, carefully rationed. Food was preserved by drying, salting, or pickling. Rice and grains were kept in watertight compartments. Live animals provided fresh meat: chickens, pigs, perhaps goats. Some ships even grew vegetables in containers of soil, fresh greens supplementing the preserved foods. Medical care aboard ship was important. The fleet's doctors knew herbal remedies for various ailments. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, treat fevers and stomach complaints. They understood that certain foods prevented scurvy, though they might not have known the scientific explanation. Fresh ginger, citrus fruits when available, certain vegetables all helped keep the crews healthy. Despite all precautions, illness and injury did occur. Men fell from rigging, were injured in storms, contracted fevers in tropical ports. Some died and were buried at sea, their bodies committed to the waves with appropriate ceremonies according to their beliefs. These were sad moments, reminders of the voyage's dangers, but they were also part of life at sea, accepted as risks that came with the sailor's profession. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering. The largest treasure ships had multiple decks, multiple masts, sophisticated steering systems. Their construction incorporated centuries of Chinese shipbuilding knowledge. The hull was divided into watertight compartments, so if one section flooded, the others would keep the ship afloat. The rudder was mounted at the stern, allowing precise steering. The sails could be adjusted individually, giving fine control over the ship's movement. These ships were built to handle the open ocean. They could survive storms that would sink smaller vessels. They were stable platforms even in rough seas. Their size meant they could carry enormous amounts of cargo while still remaining seaworthy. Inside the treasure ships, there were storage holds filled with the goods being transported. Silks carefully wrapped and stored. Porcelain packed in straw or rice husks to prevent breaking. Lacquerware, metalwork, tea, all the products of Chinese craftsmanship. There were also compartments for the gifts received in foreign ports. Ivory, exotic woods, precious stones, spices, incense. The ships carried tools and spare parts for repairs. Extra timber, rope, canvas, anvils and forges for metalwork. Everything needed to maintain the fleet far from home. This self-sufficiency was essential given the distances travelled and the length of the voyages. Navigation tools were treasured and carefully maintained. Compasses were precision instruments, their magnetized needles floating in oil or water, always pointing north. Charts were drawn on silk or paper, showing coastlines, islands, safe harbours, dangerous reefs. These charts were updated with each voyage, incorporating new knowledge, becoming more accurate and detailed. The navigators also used astronomical observations. They measured the angle of the sun at noon to determine latitude. They identified stars and constellations, using their positions to maintain course. The North Star, visible from most of their route, was particularly important. Chinese astronomy was sophisticated, and the fleet's astronomers brought this knowledge to their task. Distance was estimated by experience and by observing the ship's speed. Experienced sailors could judge how fast they were moving by watching the water flow past the hull, by the feel of the wind, by how quickly landmarks passed. This wasn't precise by modern standards, but it was accurate enough for the purposes of medieval navigation. Time was measured by water clocks, hourglasses filled with sand, and observation of the sun and stars. Keeping track of time was important for calculating position and for organizing the ship's routine of watches and meals. Communication between ships in the fleet used flags during the day and lanterns at night. Different colored flags conveyed different messages. The pattern and number of lanterns signaled various commands. In calm weather, small boats could row between ships carrying messages or supplies. During storms, maintaining formation was difficult. Ships might become separated, losing sight of each other in the high waves and driving rain. When the weather cleared, they would signal each other, regroup, and continue together. The fleet's size meant that ships could help each other if one was damaged or in trouble. The treasure fleet's voyages were long, lasting months or even years. The ships would spend weeks at sea between ports, then days or weeks at each port before continuing. The cumulative time away from home was enormous. Sailors might be gone for 2 years on a single expedition. This required mental fortitude as much as physical endurance. Homesickness was common. Men missed their families, their homes, the familiar rhythms of life on land. Letters couldn't be sent across such distances. There was no communication with home until they returned. But there was also camaraderie. The men aboard ship formed bonds, became like brothers. They relied on each other absolutely. In a storm, their lives depended on each crew member doing his job. This created deep friendships, shared experiences that could never be fully explained to those who hadn't been there. And there was pride. These men were part of something historic. They were sailing farther than Chinese sailors had ever gone before. They were representing the emperor himself, showing the world China's power and magnificence. They were seeing things most people would never see, visiting lands most Chinese had never heard of. This gave meaning to the hardships, made the sacrifices worthwhile. When the fleet finally returned to China after a voyage, the homecoming was emotional. Families reunited. Sailors walked on solid ground again, felt earth beneath their feet instead of rolling decks. They had gifts from distant lands, stories to tell, experiences to share. For a while, they were celebrities, having been part of the great treasure fleet. Then preparations would begin for the next voyage, and many of the same men would sign up again. The sea called to them. The adventure beckoned. And Zheng He's reputation was such that men were honored to serve under him. Let your mind wander now through the distant lands the treasure fleet visited, each one unique, each one adding to the tapestry of human civilization that Zheng He and his men witnessed. Picture first the ports of Southeast Asia. Champa, on the coast of what is now Vietnam, was their first regular stop. This was a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom with its own rich culture. Temples rose above the palm trees, their towers decorated with intricate carvings. The people grew rice in irrigated paddies, fished the coastal waters, traded with China and India and the islands to the south. Champa's ports were busy with activity. Junks and smaller vessels came and went. Merchants haggled in markets. The smell of fish and salt water mixed with the fragrance of tropical flowers. The treasure fleet would anchor here, rest and resupply, make diplomatic contact with local rulers before continuing south. Then came the islands and ports of Indonesia. Sumatra was large and heavily forested, its coasts dotted with trading cities. These were cosmopolitan places where people from many lands mingled. You could hear Chinese, Arabic, Tamil, Malay, Javanese, and other languages, all in the same market. The air was thick with humidity, warm and heavy. Tropical fruits unknown in China were sold in abundance. Durian with its distinctive smell, mangosteen, rambutan. Java had its great kingdoms and impressive temples. Borobudur, built centuries earlier, remained a testament to Buddhist devotion. The island was fertile, producing rice and spices. Its ports were important stops on trade routes between China and India. The Strait of Malacca was a crucial waterway, and the city of Malacca itself was emerging as a major trading center. The treasure fleet's visits helped establish Malacca's importance, and it would grow to become one of the great port cities of Asia. A place where merchants from across the maritime world met and traded, then across the Bay of Bengal to India. The voyage could take weeks, depending on the winds and weather, but eventually the coast of India would appear, and they would sail south to Calicut on the Malabar coast. Calicut was magnificent. It was ruled by the Zamorin, whose palace was a center of culture and learning. The city was wealthy from centuries of trade. Pepper grew in the hills inland, and Calicut was the primary port for exporting this precious spice. Arab and Chinese and African merchants all came here. The markets were enormous, filled with goods from across the known world. The people of Calicut were primarily Hindu, and their temples were elaborate structures with tall towers covered in colorful sculptures of gods and goddesses. Religious festivals filled the streets with music and dance, and processions of elephants decorated in brilliant colors. Indian textiles were famous for their quality and beauty. Cotton cloth in many varieties, from simple fabrics to elaborate brocades, dyed in vibrant colors, deep reds from madder, blues from indigo, yellows from turmeric. Some fabrics were printed with carved blocks, creating intricate patterns. Others were painted by hand, skilled artisans creating scenes from mythology or geometric designs. India also produced gemstones, rubies and sapphires, pearls from oysters harvested in the shallow waters along the coast. Skilled jewelers set these stones in gold, creating ornaments of exceptional beauty. The treasure fleet would spend time in Calicut and other Indian ports, Cochin, Keelon, ports on the eastern coast as well. At each stop, diplomatic meetings, gift exchanges, trade and cultural exchange. Chinese sailors walking through Indian streets, marveling at temples so different from their own religious buildings. Indian merchants examining Chinese porcelain, admiring its translucent quality and delicate painting. From India, the fleet would continue west to Arabia. The coast of Oman came first, rocky and austere. The cities here were smaller than the great ports of India, but they had their own importance. Frankincense trees grew in certain valleys, producing the resin that burned with fragrant smoke in religious ceremonies across the Islamic and Christian worlds. Dhofar was particularly known for frankincense. The treasure fleet would acquire this valuable commodity, along with myrrh, another aromatic resin. These would be transported back to China, where they would be burned in temples and palaces. Further north along the Arabian coast was Hormuz, the great port at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Hormuz was cosmopolitan and wealthy. Ships from Persia brought carpets, metalwork, and miniature paintings. Arab merchants offered horses, bred in the deserts of Arabia, tall and fast and prized for their endurance. Persian and Arab textiles, jewelry, glassware, and ceramics changed hands. The architecture here was different from Southeast Asia or India. Buildings were made of stone or mud brick, designed to stay cool in the intense heat. Courtyards provided shaded spaces. Wind towers caught breezes and channeled them into interior rooms, providing natural air conditioning. The markets of Hormuz were covered, protected from the harsh sun. Walking through them was like entering a cave of wonders. Carpets hung from walls, their geometric patterns and rich colors catching the eye. Gold and silver jewelry gleamed in the filtered light. Spices were piled in colorful pyramids, saffron's yellow-orange, cumin's brown, coriander's green. The smells were intoxicating. Mosques provided spaces for prayer. The call to prayer sounded 5 times a day, the melodious Arabic chanting echoing across the city. For Zheng He and the other Muslims in the fleet, these were familiar sounds, comforting reminders of their faith even so far from home. The Arabian Peninsula's coasts also included Yemen. The ports here traded in coffee, which was becoming increasingly popular. The drink had originated in Ethiopia, but was cultivated in Yemen, and from these ports it would spread across the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Then there was Africa. the most distant and exotic of all the lands the treasure fleet visited. The East African coast was lined with Swahili city-states. Mogadishu, Barawa, Malindi, Mombasa, Kilwa, and others. These cities were beautiful in their own way, built primarily of coral stone, a material both beautiful and practical. Coral cut from the sea would harden when exposed to air, creating blocks that could be used for construction. The buildings were whitewashed, gleaming in the bright African sun. Doors were made of carved wood, often intricately decorated, each one unique. The people of these cities were primarily Muslim, connected by trade and religion to the broader Islamic world. But they were also distinctly African, with their own languages, mostly various dialects of Swahili, their own customs, their own cultural identity that blended African, Arab, and Persian influences. The markets offered African goods, ivory from elephants, rhinoceros horn, leopard and lion skins, tortoiseshell, amber, civet musk. Gold came from inland kingdoms, transported to the coast by trade networks. Enslaved people were also traded, a grim reality of the medieval economy that we must acknowledge even as we note that the treasure fleet's primary interest was in goods and diplomatic relations, rather than this human trafficking. African textiles had their own character. Cotton cloths in patterns and colors specific to different regions. Some were tie-dyed, others resist-dyed using wax. The clothing styles were adapted to the hot climate. Loose, flowing garments that allowed air circulation. The treasure fleet also acquired exotic animals in Africa. Giraffes, as mentioned earlier, were the most famous. These gentle giants, with their impossibly long necks and distinctive spotted patterns, were completely unknown in China. Transporting them back was a major undertaking, but the reaction in China made it worthwhile. The emperor and court were amazed. Common people crowded to see these legendary-seeming creatures. Zebras were another wonder. Horses striped in black and white, looking like something from a painting rather than real animals. Ostriches, huge, flightless birds that could run faster than horses. These and other African animals made the long voyage to China ambassadors of their distant homeland. The African coast extended far to the south. The treasure fleet sailed down this coast, perhaps as far as the Mozambique Channel, exploring, making contact with more cities and kingdoms, expanding the boundaries of Chinese geographical knowledge. Each port, each kingdom, each culture the treasure fleet encountered was unique. Yet there were common patterns. Everywhere, trade connected people. Everywhere, merchants from different lands met and exchanged goods. Everywhere, Islam provided a common cultural thread, linking Arabia and Persia and India and Africa and Southeast Asia in a vast cosmopolitan network. The treasure fleet inserted China into this network on an unprecedented scale. Chinese goods flowed west, foreign goods flowed east. Diplomatic connections were established. Cultural exchange increased. For a few decades, China was a major player in Indian Ocean affairs, respected and influential. The men of the treasure fleet saw all of this. They walked through the markets of Calicut and Hormuz and Malindi. They met people of different races, heard different languages, saw different ways of life. For most, this was probably their first encounter with such diversity. Some surely found it overwhelming or strange, but others must have been fascinated, curious about these different cultures, eager to learn and experience. Zheng He himself, as a Muslim, could communicate easily with Muslims in Arabia and Africa. He understood their customs, their religion, their way of life. This likely helped in diplomatic negotiations, creating bonds of religious brotherhood that transcended national differences. The treasure fleet was more than just ships and sailors. It was a bridge between China and the wider world. For 30 years, this bridge connected civilizations that were otherwise distant and disconnected. Knowledge flowed across it, goods flowed across it, people crossed it and returned with new understanding. When the voyages ended and China turned inward, this bridge was dismantled. The connections weakened and eventually faded. China and the Indian Ocean world grew more distant from each other. It would be centuries before such extensive contact was re-established, and by then the world had changed dramatically. Breathe slowly and deeply now, letting these thoughts settle gently in your mind like silt drifting to the bottom of a still pool. What do we make of Zheng He and his voyages today, looking back across 6 centuries? What meaning do these events hold for us? On one level, they are simply fascinating history. The idea of enormous wooden ships sailing tens of thousands of miles, carrying tens of thousands of people, establishing diplomatic relations with dozens of kingdoms. It captures the imagination. It seems almost fantastical, like something from a legend or a fantasy novel. Yet it really happened. The treasure fleet represents human capability at its finest. The shipbuilding, the navigation, the logistics, the organization, all required sophisticated knowledge and skill. These were not primitive people stumbling around in boats. These were highly accomplished mariners, using advanced technology, conducting complex operations successfully. The Voyages also represent a particular approach to power and diplomacy. The treasure fleet demonstrated that a nation could project influence without conquest. It showed that trade and cultural exchange could be powerful tools of statecraft. It offered a model of international relations based on mutual benefit rather than domination. This is not to idealize Zheng He or the Ming Dynasty. They were products of their time, with values and assumptions we might question today. The tributary system they were promoting placed China at the center, expecting other nations to acknowledge Chinese superiority. The gifts exchanged were not between equals, but between superior and inferior in the Chinese worldview. Yet compared to the colonialism that would come later, the treasure fleet's approach was relatively benign. They did not seize territory. They did not impose Chinese rule. They did not systematically exploit the places they visited. They came, they traded, they established relationships, and they left. There is also something poignant about the Voyages. They represent a road not taken, a path that history almost followed, but ultimately didn't. If China had continued its maritime expansion, if the treasure fleet had kept sailing, how might the world be different? Perhaps Chinese culture would have spread more widely across the Indian Ocean world. Perhaps Chinese merchant communities would have established themselves in African and Arabian ports. Perhaps technological exchange would have been more extensive, with Chinese inventions spreading faster and foreign innovations reaching China more readily. Or perhaps Chinese colonialism would have developed, with Chinese rulers claiming foreign territories, Chinese settlers displacing native populations, Chinese economic exploitation creating the same patterns of inequality and resentment that European colonialism generated. We cannot know. History happened as it did, not as it might have. China chose one path, Europe chose another, and the consequences of those choices shape the world we live in today. For Zheng He himself, we can only imagine what these voyages meant. He left no memoir, no personal writings that reveal his inner thoughts. We know the facts of his life and achievements, but not his feelings, his doubts, his hopes, his reflections. Did he feel pride in what he had accomplished? Surely he must have. He had led the greatest maritime expeditions in history. He had served his emperor faithfully. He had demonstrated Chinese power across the known world. These were achievements any person would be proud of. Did he feel sorrow when the voyages ended, when China turned inward, and the ships he had commanded were left to rot? Did he regret that his life's work would not continue, that the connections he had established would weaken and fade? Or did he accept it with the philosophical resignation of someone who understood that all things change, that empires rise and fall, that even the greatest achievements are temporary? These questions have no answers. Zheng He died nearly 600 years ago. His thoughts died with him. We are left with his actions, with the historical records of what he did, and with our own reflections on what it all means. In China today, Zheng He is celebrated as a national hero. His voyages are taught in schools, commemorated in museums, honored in monuments and statues. He represents Chinese achievement, Chinese exploration, Chinese connection to the wider world. In an era when China is again looking outward, engaging with the world economy, projecting power beyond its borders, Zheng He serves as a historical precedent, a reminder that China was once the world's greatest maritime power. Outside China, Zheng He is less well known to the general public, though scholars and historians recognize his importance. In the countries he visited, there are sometimes local memories or legends about the great Chinese fleet. In some places, archaeological evidence confirms the historical records. In a few places, monuments or temples associated with Zheng He's visits still exist. The treasure fleet's voyages remind us that the world has always been interconnected. Even in the medieval era, goods and ideas and people moved across vast distances. The Indian Ocean world was cosmopolitan and diverse, with merchants from many lands meeting and trading. Maritime routes connected civilizations that were thousands of miles apart. These connections were real and important, even if they were less dense and comprehensive than the global connections we have today. Spices from Indonesia ended up in Chinese kitchens. Chinese porcelain decorated African homes. Arabian horses were ridden in Southeast Asian kingdoms. Ideas flowed along with goods. Religious teachings, scientific knowledge, artistic techniques, technologies. The treasure fleet was part of this larger pattern of connection. It enhanced and accelerated it for a few decades. Then China withdrew, and the pattern continued without Chinese participation, until European ships began to dominate the seas and reshape the global networks of trade and exchange. Today, we live in a world that is far more interconnected than Zheng He could have imagined. Information flows instantly across the globe. Goods are shipped between continents in days rather than months. People can travel from China to Africa in hours by airplane, rather than months by ship. The global economy links all nations in complex webs of trade and finance. Yet the basic human patterns that Zheng He encountered remain. People still trade goods across long distances. Merchants still seek profit. Nations still conduct diplomacy. Cultural exchange still occurs, though now it happens through internet and media as much as through personal contact. And ships still sail the seas, though modern container ships and tankers are vastly different from the wooden treasure ships of the Ming dynasty. The routes are similar though, from China through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean to Arabia and Africa, carrying goods between continents, connecting distant peoples. In this sense, Zheng He's voyages are not just historical curiosities. They are part of an ongoing human story of connection and exchange, of curiosity about distant places, of the drive to explore and trade and establish relationships across cultural boundaries. Let yourself relax completely now. The story is nearly told. The great voyages are complete. The ships have returned to harbour for the last time. The Admiral has passed into history, his work done, his legacy secure. Think of a treasure ship at anchor in a calm harbour, its sails furled, rocking gently with the tide. The water laps quietly against the hull. The deck is empty now, the crew's dispersed, the cargo unloaded. But the ship remains, solid and serene, a testament to what was accomplished. The sun is setting, painting the sky in soft colours, pink and orange fading to purple and deep blue. Stars begin to appear, the same stars that guided the treasure fleet across thousands of miles of ocean. The first star, then more, then countless points of light emerging from the darkening sky. Somewhere, in a distant port that the treasure fleet once visited, people go about their evening routines. Merchants close their shops. Families gather for evening meals. The day's work is done, and the night brings rest. In Calicut, perhaps, an old merchant remembers when the great Chinese ships came. He was young then, and the sight of those massive vessels impressed him deeply. He tells his grandchildren about it sometimes, though they have trouble believing ships could be so large. It's true, he insists. I saw them with my own eyes. In Mogadishu, a piece of Chinese porcelain sits in a family's home, treasured across generations. No one remembers exactly when it arrived, only that it is old and beautiful and precious. The delicate blue painting on white ceramic has survived centuries, a tangible link to distant places and long ago voyages. In China, at a temple or monastery, an old man who once sailed with the treasure fleet tells his story to younger monks. I saw Africa, he says. I saw strange animals and met people who looked and talked differently from anyone I'd known. I sailed farther than most people can imagine. The monks listen respectfully, honoring this elder who participated in something extraordinary. These memories fade with time. The people who witnessed the treasure fleet die, and eventually no one living remembers. The voyages become history, then legend, then nearly forgotten. Centuries pass, but nothing is ever truly lost. The porcelain survives in African soil, waiting for archaeologists to discover it. The stone inscriptions that Zheng He's expeditions erected remain weathered but readable. The historical records, though diminished, contain enough information for later scholars to reconstruct what happened. The legacy persists, waiting to be rediscovered. And in our own time, Zheng He is remembered again. His story is told again. His achievements are recognized. The treasure fleet sails again in books and documentaries and museum exhibits. Children in China and elsewhere learn about this admiral who commanded the greatest fleet of his age, who sailed across vast oceans, who demonstrated that exploration and diplomacy can go hand in hand. There is comfort in this. The good that people do survives them, even if it seems lost for a while. The connections we make with others, the bridges we build between cultures, the understanding we foster, these things matter even if their effects are not immediately visible. Zheng He built bridges between civilizations. For 30 years he maintained connections across thousands of miles. When those bridges were dismantled and the connections weakened, something was lost. But the very fact that it was possible, that it was done, remains important. It shows that human beings can cooperate across vast differences, can trade peacefully, can learn from each other. In our interconnected modern world, we need these examples. We need reminders that connection is possible, that cooperation can be achieved, that different cultures can interact beneficially. Zheng He's Voyages, 6 centuries in the past, still teach us something valuable. As you drift toward sleep now, perhaps you can carry with you an image. A great ship sailing peaceful seas under a star-filled sky, making its way steadily toward distant shores, carrying messages of friendship, seeking connection rather than conquest, demonstrating that the best of human nature is not domination, but understanding, not isolation, but engagement, not fear of the foreign, but curiosity about the different. The voyage continues, in a sense,